Welcome to Coming Clean, the podcast dedicated to common sense environmental dialogue, environmental optimism, and real environmental solutions. This show is proudly powered by Ørsted.
Hello, everyone. This is Chris Barnard, ACC's president, taking over from Stephen Perkins for this exciting podcast today. Joining me is Andrew Spencer. He's a Christian thinker, writer, and editor. He currently serves as the books editor for the Gospel Coalition. But before that, he actually spent over 10 years as an instructor at 2 commercial nuclear power plants, in addition to serving as a submarine officer in the U.S. Navy. He is also an upcoming research fellow for the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and a senior research fellow for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. But the most interesting thing to me, however, and what we're going to be spending most of the time talking about today, is his recent book called Hope for God's Creation: Stewardship in an Age of Futility, which won an award merit in the Popular Theology category from Christianity Today's 2024 Book Awards. Andrew, it's so great to have you. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, I would love to kind of pick up where I left off with the introduction there and just have you introduce yourself beyond what I said and just kind of talk a little bit about kind of why you care about these issues and kind of setting the scene for them.
Yeah, so I grew up in rural Western New York and didn't have a really strong interest in the environment per se, other than the fact that, I walked out my back door and it was great as a kid to be able to head out into the woods and walk for a mile or two before you saw the next dirt road. So a lot of memories of spending time camping out in the woods and, just messing around as a kid. So that was kind of the environment that I grew up in. But simultaneously, my hometown is the home of the U.S.'s only commercially operated nuclear fuel rod reprocessing plant. And so at the time, there was a lot of contention. You had the Love Canal dump that got found out in the late 70s, late 80s. And then there was a huge debate in my hometown about taking that cleanup project from the fuel rod reprocessing plant and turning it into a low-level radioactive waste storage facility, kind of long-term, to put medical waste and other things like that. And so I was involved in that debate as a kid and kind of watched adults engage in that debate as a kid. And it raised my awareness, at least for the issue, though my perspectives on nuclear power in particular have changed over time because of that. So that's been the general interest. And then, as I worked through my Master of Divinity and then the PhD in Christian ethics, I became aware that as someone who had spent time studying the technical aspect of nuclear power and energy generation, that as a practitioner and a professional, that I had an opportunity to kind of speak into a gap where there were fewer conservative theological and political and environmental ethicists from the Protestant ranks. And so it was really an opportunity that I dug into and was able to develop and the book as a result.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit because it definitely is something that I've experienced as well. And a lot of what you said actually resonates with me. I grew up in Belgium, actually, which is one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. And we were fortunate enough to live near forests so that I could escape to the forest and battle imaginary orcs with my friends when we were young and go camping and mess around over there. Like it was just such an important part of my personal affinity for the environment. But then also growing up in a Christian household, I think what you said, like there was a gap. Like I don't necessarily think that I ever heard, whether it was in church or whether it was elsewhere in popular culture, Christians and especially conservative, like theologically conservative and politically conservative Christians talking about the environment in a way that resonated, but also in a way that I felt was like biblically accurate and relevant. And so I'd love to kind of get your views on why you think there's a gap. Like, how did this gap emerge? What does the gap look like? And why are you so passionate about like filling that gap?
So, um, part of the reason why there's a gap, especially among conservative Christians, is that when you look at the evolution of environmental ethics, especially in the United States, which is the context I'm most familiar with, um, it is an evolution of liberal Christian theology. Evan Barry wrote a book for University of California Press, tracking this back, the history of environmental ethics. And he noted that they borrowed a lot of language from kind of mainline and progressive Christian thinkers. And so there was a lot of resistance among conservative theological Christian thinkers because of this importing of language. So even back before that, you got Muir, who was disciples of Christ uh, as a kid, and then kind of converted to mountainanity, where he was seeking to encounter God out in the wilderness. And so it was very much a kind of a pantheistic, almost a deification of nature. So when you look at how a conservative Christian is going to respond, they're going to push back against that and probably avoid the subject, because it's really hard sometimes to talk about the topic without people perceiving that you're doing something that's specifically left coded, which is especially in the U.S., right? Because the political context in Europe is significantly different in terms of left coding, right coding, especially around the environment. But those are big issues. Then you look at in 1967, Lynn White Jr. publishes an article in Science magazine that's all about, it blames Christianity. The historic roots of our ecological crisis is the name of the essay. And he basically goes back and he just says it's because Christianity is dualistic, that it views spirit as good and material as bad. And so Christians are responsible for the ecological crisis because they've devalued creation, which isn't true, actually. Modernity, kind of the break that happened around the Enlightenment, where you have deism that rises, that doesn't see an active creator God in creation, and also the way, like, Francis Bacon talks about, when you read his New Organon, there's specific language in there about conquering creation that's very it's the domination that people sometimes blame conservative Christians of. And so, but when you have somebody tell you you're absolutely wrong and this is why, and it doesn't represent you, that tends to be very off-putting. Simultaneously, Mark Stoll is a historian at Texas Tech, and in one of his books, he documents how most of the early leaders in the environmental movement in the U.S. were actually they grew up in a Christian context and kind of converted and replaced their Christian belief with an environmental belief. And so again, you see that kind of barrier that builds up. Then furthermore, in 1970, you have Richard Nixon, who actually is still touted as one of the greenest presidents in U.S. history. He commissioned the Rockefeller Commission on the American Future and Population, which then that took him 2 years to actually do the study. In 1972, they published that study. It's public record now, but they strongly advocated for public funding for abortion and contraception, and not quite to the extent of population control measures like a Paul Ehrlich might have preferred, they would have argued, but that was kind of the general thrust of it. And again, that's at the time where, Roe v. Wade's being pronounced about that time, and so you have a theological and political conservative negative reaction to some of these cultural changes that are going on. That's then shifted it into a predominantly left-coded issue.
I think it's interesting to me kind of hearing that background with the way that ACC as an organization kind of looks at the conservative political aspect of kind of the environmental and climate conversation, because when we talk about like this issue and the way that it used to be, like farmers and ranchers and hunters and anglers, like these are the people that were conservationists because they lived in the land every day. They were concerned with actually protecting the land that they were a part of, and their livelihoods relied on that. But then, like you mentioned, like in the era of Nixon around 1970 when you had the first Earth Day, all of a sudden this issue became not like a salt of the earth kind of like rural American thing. It became like a liberal elite, like college educated activism thing. And so a lot of conservatives looked at that and no longer felt
Right.
comfortable in those conversations. And I think that very much reflects on what you said, like conservative Christians no longer felt comfortable in the conversation because of the way that like more progressive Christians were talking
Hmm.
about this. And then the same way politically, we started saying essentially we don't like the solutions and the rhetoric of the other side, so we're going to deny the problem altogether. And that's just a fascinating parallel between kind of the conservative political aspect and the conservative religious aspect in the U.S. I'd love to get your thoughts on how you think we can like go back to first principles to break that misunderstanding. Like, could you explain to people that are listening to this that aren't like entirely sure of what like the Christian environmental ethic really is? Like, what does it mean, and why is this sense that Christians just don't like the earth and want to subjugate it? Why is that so false?
Yeah. So it really the way I frame it is in four basic questions, and so the way I frame it is in four basic questions where, um, and I found this across literature. This was what my dissertation was. It was secular and Christian literature. Everybody has to answer these four basic questions in order to discuss um, what is the value of the creation order, a created order. Uh, where did it come from? What is the human place within creation? The Then what is the end goal of creation? And so those are kind of the fundamental, the key four questions in there. And so when I frame this out as a Christian, I'm going to answer these in a particular way. Creation has value because God made it. God spoke it into existence. And when you look at the text of Genesis, right, he 6 times during the creation account said, "This is good." And when he had created all of it, he said, "This is very good." And when then he took Adam and he put him into the garden. And so Genesis 2:5 says that actually God waited until he created Adam to finish the creation because there was no one to tend the garden. And then in Genesis 2:15, the mandate is given to Adam and Eve to cultivate and keep the garden. So there's an agricultural purpose, which then is repeated in Genesis 9. So even after the judgment of sin and the flood and all that, that mandate to care for creation, right? To be fruitful and multiply, that's reiterated. Now, the other piece in this is what's your source of authority? Obviously, as a Christian, my source of authority, the primary one, is the text of Scripture. Now, this is one of the challenges we get into because you talk about creation, and some people think creationism, and it's not about the age of the earth so much as it's about the value of creation, and we've addressed that. So where does your authority come from? Someone who is going to presuppose that science is the primary authority, whatever science means, right? If we put a "the" in front of it, we've got a problem. They're gonna potentially argue that I'm going to follow the data. The problem with that approach, especially as a Christian, is that the data can never tell you what to do. It can always tell you what is, but you can't make the change between what is and what ought to be. There's some sort of moral framework that we all bring to the table when we interpret scientific data. And as a Christian, I just want to be honest and say, mine is the text of Scripture. That's the ultimate norm, and I need to conform myself to that. Whereas sometimes I think people that are kind of on the atheistic, scientific approach, materialistic approach, they kind of sneak their presuppositions into the conversation. There's those two questions. Then what is a place in humanity? Well, that's answered by the creation account. God put us in creation. And then finally, what's the end goal of it? And the end goal of what God has made is his own glory. So as a Christian, I believe that it's going to be redeemed, renewed, and restored in a way that brings all things to culmination and perfection in his glory. And that's going to happen supernaturally. Now, what that does for me as a conservative Christian is that it tells me that I have a role to play within creation because it's good. And God gave me that authority and that responsibility to tend to the garden. And yet I don't have to bring things to perfection. So ultimate, absolute perfection isn't my goal. I'm not trying to repristinate something to an existence where humans don't exist or where there's no sign of development. In fact, the picture that the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, gives us is of a garden city. And so that is what I'm going to pursue. And I steal language from Francis Schaeffer, 1970s theologian who wrote Pollution and the Death of Man, the first evangelical book on environmental ethics. He says, he calls it substantial healing, where every day in the ways that we can within our spheres of influence, we are going to actively seek to make things better, but understand that ultimate perfection isn't going to come through human effort.
Right. And similarly to, again, like drawing that parallel between like the political and the religious conversation, if you are a conservative that cares about climate and environmental issues, then you have to both you have a dual task, right? You have to say why like big government top down left wing solutions are bad, but then you also have to hold conservatives accountable for not having being good stewards of the planet and by being honest and in tackling these issues. I think there's like a similar dynamic at play here with Christians. We have to point out why kind of like the purely materialistic scientific approach of this, like devoid of any morals, is bad.
Mhm.
But then we also need to hold Christians accountable that have failed to make these arguments or actually push back against the idea that humans can even influence something like climate change or can have an impact on the earth. And like staying on that side of the conversation, it's always baffled me that Christians have said, well, God's in control, like we there's nothing we can really do about climate change because like God will just take care of us and whatnot. But if you look at the entire kind of crux of the Bible is that we did terrible things to our fellow humans, to the land, to creation, and like going all the way back to Genesis, like God allowed Adam and Eve to fall, and that look at all the ripple effects of that throughout history, and just seems so weird to me that Christians would argue that humans aren't able to have a really dreadful impact on the planet. And so it's like, how can we hold Christians accountable to kind of bad theology on this issue and not let them fall into the trap of like, oh, the other side is saying this, so we're just going to put our heads in the sand and ignore it.
Right. And yeah, you got to answer bad speech with good speech. And you're absolutely right. When you look, there's a lot of prohibition concerns about the environment in the Old Testament, in particular. You look at the way warfare was commissioned, and you know when you were supposed to go and take a city, a siege of a city, there were specific instructions not to cut down the fruit trees, right? And there's a population concern issue there. But it's fruitfulness of the land. Now, one thing that's changed since scripture was written is that we now have way more power because of the development of technology to actually cause damage on some of these things. But you're absolutely correct that when you look at the text of scripture, there's desertification, there's things that people did to the environment. So to believe that we couldn't do that, that's just not supported by scripture. So yeah, we've got to push that. And it's the same thing with conservatives, right? Political conservatives. Like, we're always reactionary. You know, we're standing athwart history yelling "stop," right, at some level, and or you know, the G.K. Chesterton example is not removing barriers that we don't understand, right? We have to figure out why the barrier's there before we remove it, and that's kind of our job. Roger Scruton is helpful here because he argues for oikophilia, right? Love of your place, love of your household, right? And that is ultimately a very conservative thing to do. But because we're afraid of falling into the kind of the traps of the left wing top down solutions for everything, we've kind of, you know, held ourselves back and not engaged in positive ways in the conversation.
Yeah, and like Roger Scruton is someone that at ACC and I personally like talked a lot about, and obviously he was a very well regarded conservative philosopher who very much understood how these issues play together. And the interesting thing about oikophilia and how this applies to the conservative context is like we believe that the first order of charity starts with the individual and with their community, well, their household and their community and their church. And it's like it's your backyard. If you can take care of your backyard, then that's a great place to start. But at the same time, like throughout Christian history, there has been this concept of the common good
Mhm.
and making sure that we are doing things where we're not just like, oh, my life is great, but those other people, screw them. We don't care about them. No, like the Christian worldview very much is about ensuring that society as a whole, like God's kingdom, is well represented and taken care of, and on the right path. And I think it's important to have that kind of like local, bottom up, community based, church based approach to environmental issues. But I think you could also make an argument that because of our dedication to the common good, that at a broader societal level, at a national level, even at an international level, there's reason to be engaged in this
Mhm.
conversation. It just needs to be through policies that actually work and that understand trade offs. Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to protect the environment, but in doing so, you're like thrusting millions of people into poverty because
Mhm.
you ban fossil fuels overnight, then that's not just either. You're trading one idea of justice for another, and I think part of the conservative approach to these issues is there are trade-offs. Like we want to protect the environment, we want to reduce pollution, reduce emissions, but you can't actually have the solutions be worse than the problem itself. So I'm curious how you kind of think about the solution set through a Christian conservative lens.
Yeah, so trade-offs are a key part of any thinking, and it's just a recognition that there's no free lunch, as the economists tell us, right? Um, but that means that there's trade-offs in terms of economic trade-offs. So we don't necessarily get the full, absolute free libertarian perspective as the ideal, right? Because we recognize that part of the reason why there's laws that constrain markets at different points is in order to um, pursue the common good, and because there are specific things that people are doing that need to be restrained. So, like Milton and Rose Freeman in their Free to Choose actually argue for environmental regulation um, as a way of internalizing what otherwise is external, which they were thinking of sulfur emissions primarily because that was the big thing when they wrote that book. We might think of that as CO2 emissions as the waste from fossil fuels. Um, so, while I affirm the goodness of a generally free market, I also recognize that, hey, some of these regulations are necessary, and we have to play those trade-off games. And we go back to, there were no, like back in the 1950s, there actually were no um, discharge regulations, which is one of the reasons why Nixon was the one that founded the EPA. Because in like 1967, you have the Cuyahoga River lighting on fire. Now, it wasn't the first river to light on fire in the U.S., but it was the one that made the news. And so clearly there had to be something done to regulate some sort of emissions and dumping of the oil, because there was no rule on that whatsoever at that point, and people weren't looking out to the common good. And so, but the problem is some of those regulations have been reified and become static, and have there's been a pursuit in some cases of like zero emissions or zero release out there in ways that have raised costs and not really improved the benefit at the same time. And really, you know, again, substantial healing is my goal. I'm not pursuing perfection, but I'm trying to make things realistically better, which means that I'm going to have to concede on some points where, okay, if we can get the whatever being released into the environment down to a much safer level without creating such high energy costs that the working class people that live, in the neighborhood next to me can't afford to heat their home without going, bankrupt, then those are trade-offs that I want to make. And you made that point well, especially in the energy realm, which I have some more familiarity with. Uh, there's there's a lot of utopian thinking, right? And I have rooftop solar, right? I have 3 kilowatts of rooftop solar because that's the most I could fit on my garage, right? And I worked in nuclear. I'm a big fan of renewable, big fan of nuclear, but there's there's risk associated with nuclear. There's waste associated with the end of life for my solar panels, and the land usage for bigger solar installations. Those are all things that we've got to trade off and we've got to balance in there. And so what we have to do as conservatives is, instead of avoiding the conversation or being reactionary or just saying, Naomi Klein said no nuclear, so I'm going to say all nuclear, or something like that, that we have to be positively engaged in looking for solutions that balance the economic, the environmental, and really the health needs of every community that we can, and do the best we can with it.
Yeah, and I think that we talked a little bit about like why Christians and conservatives need to be better at talking about these issues, and it's just like flipping that on its head. I think there's a strong point to be made that you mentioned, like the scientific materialism of a lot of kind of the environmental atheists and the way they look at that. I think from a Christian perspective, the biggest worry there is that they look at it and they look at humans as almost like
Mhm.
disposable, like pieces on the chessboard, and they kind of deify nature to some extent, and we've seen that a lot in the kind of like anti-human Malthusian narrative, and there even like some of the arguments that we've seen for like population
Mhm.
control, or for like even some folks have said like for abortion, like these are ways of tackling climate change because fewer humans is better for the world. And I think you're fundamentally missing the forest for the trees, to use an environmental analogy there, because if your goal is to protect future life by getting rid of current life, then that just doesn't make any logical sense. It's just like, how can we like live in a world where we give people a reason to love humans again, but also love the planet, and
Mhm.
understand that those two things aren't mutually exclusive? And I think some of the like conservative views that have been like, well, we'll just like drill baby drill, like it doesn't matter, are frankly like quite anti-environmental.
Mhm.
But then some of the like far left solutions have been quite anti-human. It's like, why do we have to pit humans against nature when, like, as Genesis tells us, like they were made like to live in unison together, in harmony together. So how can we reframe that narrative? And also I think in a world right now where so many people are like on social media, they're addicted to scrolling on their phones. Like if you look at depression and anxiety, like the levels are sky high, just continually going up. People are just pretty miserable, and the polling and mental health attitudes clearly reflect that. So people are looking for an alternative sense of meaning. How can Christians, conservatives, people that care about the environment, kind of combine those different pieces to show like, hey, actually, if you go outside, it's your responsibility to take care of where you
Right.
are. If you see trash, pick it up, but also kind of have an attitude of, oh, I'm in a beautiful place. Like this is God's creation. We should be honoring that. We should be enjoying that, allowing that to refresh us and fill us. Um, just I don't know where I'm going with that, but I would love your thoughts on how those different threads come together, and then how it can provide a compelling message in a world that is defined by kind of just depression and a lack of meaning.
Well, climate anxiety is a huge thing, and I'm actually working on a book on that right now, and uh, exploring that topic. And what I'm seeing, especially in Gen Z and younger, is that climate anxiety is becoming more significant. And as I read people's own testimony to why they're anxious about climate change, and they're asking the question, "Can I have kids? Is it ethical for me to have kids?" Um, the big key is, first of all, assuming that your child is going to have the same impact that you had. But there's a whole range of choices that we have to make in order in with regard to the actual carbon impact of our kids and our lifetime. So that's one assumption. Another major assumption is, you know, is human life in and of itself good? So you get the ahumanist movement, which is kind of on the fringe of environmental. Excuse me. I'm going to start that over again. So you get the ahumanist movement, which is kind of on the fringe of the environmental movement, and like Patricia McCormick wrote the Ahumanist Manifesto, and she is arguing for human extinction, not for people to be killed that are currently alive, but that, there's sterilization, that should become a policy, and those sorts of things. And in some sense, that's not actually a new thing, because, Ehrlich was arguing for that. There's a uh, former Southern Baptist that wrote a book, The Case for Compulsory Birth Control, where he argued for a limit on kids with regulations and that sort of thing. And what we have to recognize is that's a deep, dark place to be. But what's causing this concern is the feeling that kind of I'm the center of the universe, I'm the protagonist of the world, and that I have to save the world in and of myself. And our part to play is much, much smaller than that. Now, we should be very concerned about what we do and try and minimize our impact. So this is things that we can take personal responsibility for, and, like having solar panels on our roof, like thinking about before we drive, do I need to make this trip? Can I consolidate these things? One of the most frustrating things to me as an environmentalist is kind of sitting, watching the drive-through and seeing people in a huge SUV with the Sierra Club sticker on the back of it, idling as they wait for their iced coffee in the middle of July, right? Because clearly there's a lot of choices that are going on with that. And there may be, reasons why that's an appropriate choice for that person, but there's a mismatch. So, but my responsibility as a person isn't to try and make everyone else do what I think they ought to do. And that's what causes the despair. I'm not big enough to make these changes. But what I can do is control what I can control. So that tends to de-escalate things. And then again, you go back to substantial healing, right? I don't have to make it all better. I just have to make it a little bit better, in as much as I have control. And then, when we come right down to it and we think about a human future or a future that doesn't have humans, that's a pretty dark place to be. And why are we focused on that? Why not look at the goodness of humanity? So back in the 1970s, when the population debate, the population bomb came out, Ehrlich wrote that. I think he published it in 1967, but it was the culmination of a big debate out there. So you have Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Life and Death of American Cities, big city planner first in New York City and then in Toronto. And she argued, actually, that because humans are both producers and consumers, that what we actually need are more humans to help us solve some of these problems. We need more of these scientists to start thinking through how can we make things better. And Betsy Richardson, who is an abortion advocate, actually, an advocate for what she calls reproductive rights, makes the case in her book that when people are talking about population control, they're almost always talking about population control over there, which usually means brown and poor people. And so but the interesting thing that she points out is, well, a couple things. One is that this almost always leads to human rights violation, whether it's forced sterilization or policies that are really just punitive against poor people that are trying to find their way up, because they're the ones that have typically the higher birth rate. Because right now the U.S. we're not at replacement rate, and the reason why we're close is because largely because of immigrants. So you have that piece, and she also points out the fact that the people that are having the most kids have the smallest carbon footprint because they're not living the Western lifestyle. So when we look at climate anxiety, when we look at all those concerns about humanity, what we really need to do is begin to roll back our own expectations for our lifestyle, because it's ridiculous that over the last 30 to 40 years, the size of the average American home has gone up by more than 1,000 square feet, right? And so, with all these economic policies, all these things about home prices, and there's some real things with interest rates and all those things that are going on, they're strained. But when we go back and look at the starter home that my parents had or that my grandparents had, my grandparents, it was a kit home from, post-World War II, one of these Sears and Roebuck kit homes they put together that was like 900 square feet, and they fit a whole bunch of kids in there. So we've raised our expectation. And so what we need to do is instead of saying we need fewer people, we need to kind of reel back some of these extravagant expectations for energy consumption and really reshape how we view the world so that we're being more environmentally friendly and welcoming new life in to the world as we can.
And I think part of that is like showing the hypocrisy of people that think like, oh, we'll just like force them to move away from fossil fuels overnight, or stop them from using them altogether. Like we've seen some of those conversations about the developing world, and like you said, the people that would be poor, like that will be hit most by these kind of bad energy policies are like poor brown people essentially in the global south and in the developing world, and kind of this, to some extent, it's almost like a neo-colonial
Right.
mindset where we can dictate what their future looks like and we can dictate how they use their energy. And if we're depriving them of the ability to industrialize and have a higher standard of living, then they're going to die faster, they're going to die younger, they're going to live much worse lives than they otherwise could. And I don't see, again, like coming to this term that the left likes to use, like I don't see any justice or environmental justice in that at all. So I think some of this is, again, to the conversation about
Mhm.
trade-offs, pointing out why these policies that are being pushed, whether it's phasing out fossil fuels, being anti-nuclear energy, like we saw in Sri Lanka, getting rid of synthetic fertilizers, uh, pretty much overnight, and all of a sudden millions of people were starving because they realized that modern agriculture can't survive without that. And so, how can we create a world where people are, yes, like not destroying the environment, but also not starving or unaware of where their next meal is going to come
Mhm.
from? I think balancing the human needs with the environmental needs is something that often gets lost in this conversation. I know we're kind of going a little long here, but just want to ask a final question to you about um, like your experience in the nuclear
Mhm.
industry, because you have this, I believe it's an upcoming talk where you're talking about kind of nuclear energy and from a Christian perspective, and obviously you have a decade of experience in the nuclear industry. I would love to hear your thoughts on how that fits into everything we'd be talking about and the arguments you're using, and why you think nuclear energy is something that both conservatives and Christians should be embracing.
Yeah, so that was last week. It was a great conference at Pepperdine. I learned a whole lot about it, and a lot of practitioners from MIT, Abilene Christian University. A guy that's putting in a test reactor with a plan to commercialize and put some of these molten salt reactors out there. So really kind of exciting. Um, and the reason why I think that's important is because one of the keys to human flourishing in the world and also environmental health is getting some sort of energy to people. Like if you could provide a reliable electricity economically to to people who are in poverty, the improvement is pretty significant and pretty rapid. And nuclear power has the potential to offer that. Now, we have our own issues in the U.S. with building. Large scale nuclear is expensive, as we've seen with the Vogtle 3 and 4 project. Things take longer, they go over budget, that sort of thing. But when we look at potentially smaller applications that where regulation is still sufficient, but also flexible enough to allow new technologies without extensive and overly concerning and analysis and approval processes. So regulation reform, right, which I know you guys are big into, those things could enable us to more economically produce um, energy that's available that can help lift people out of poverty. So one of the things that the guy at the Abilene Christian University was talking about, because they're putting in this test reactor, they're working on their contract or their permit to build from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is you're looking at medical isotopes that can help target cancers and help people to be healthier. But you're also looking at smaller modular reactors that could be put into areas and regions that don't have the huge distribution system. And now you can run hospitals reliably and just allow people to build manufacturing facilities and pursue a level of economic engagement and human flourishing that will enrich their lives and allow them to kind of live fuller economic, participation in the broader global community. The thing that always gets nuclear, and one is the cost, right? It costs a lot to build, and that is part of it. I think the modular reactors have potential for that. The nuclear industry has sometimes overpromised and underdelivered, and that's a thing that they're concerned about and they're trying to fix as well as they can. Part of the problem, though, is that when you build 2 reactors, you have all the design costs and all the development costs that get concentrated on those 2. You need to build 30. Then you get some repetition and some cost reduction and some analysis and some carryover, so they get more economical as you do that. And then the other piece, you get the cost, and then you have the waste. And a really interesting presentation from the nuclear engineer from MIT, where she talked about the waste. And the reality is that all of the fuel in the U.S. from the 50 years of nuclear fuel rod usage that we've had could be concentrated to the footprint of something like the Superdome, right? That's all of it, and safely stored. So we don't have the perfect solution yet, but we have reliable solutions in the long term. And the other piece with it is that when people talk about waste, they're like, well, it's not going to be gone for 1 million years. Well, there's already uranium in the ground. And it's a naturally occurring element. It's already, it's fissioning. There's actually, in Africa, the Oklo reactor, which naturally reacts. It has a chain reaction sometimes. And so those things exist. So there are things that we don't need to be as afraid of as we are. So part of what we need to do is begin to look at what the actual real risks are, and talk about them consistently so that people understand them, and that we can have these meaningful conversations and show people that it's not really as big and scary as it needs to be. So it is kind of a justice issue, because it increases human flourishing, and the risks and the dangers aren't as bad as people say.
Yeah. No, well, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, ACC heavily supports nuclear, and it's the technology that our grassroots base really supports as well. And I think sometimes using some of those arguments beyond just like, oh, it's clean, but
Mhm.
like, oh, this will like help with, for example, cancer and medical research and things like
Yep.
that is a really helpful way to disarm people that might be more skeptical of nuclear. Quick last question is just how can people learn more about your work? This has been really fascinating for people in the audience that are Christians, they're conservatives, and they also care about this issue. How can they keep up to date with what you're doing? How can they continue to be better stewards of God's creation? What final parting words do you have for them?
Well, my book's available on Amazon. I write periodically at ethicsandculture.com. I also write for the Gospel Coalition, and do a lot of work there. And so I'm working on a book on climate anxiety, because I think that's a major issue that we've got to address, especially as conservatives, to help people reason through these things. And so that's where I would tell people to follow along. And then the other piece is that it's just the recognition that you can't get to a good end point by doing something bad. And so whatever we do for the environment, we have to make sure that we're not doing more harm in another way, in order to try and pursue that good. And so, that's the goal. That's the problem with some of the proposals from the left is they don't take into the full orbed ethics. We need to look at all of human flourishing as well as the flourishing of all of the created order, and pursue that with as few trade-offs as we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Andrew. This has been a fascinating conversation. Look forward to keeping in touch, and recommend everyone check out your book on Amazon. And also check out the Gospel Coalition, because they really do put out some really great stuff in general about theology and Christian issues, but also especially about environmental issues. So go check them out as well. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
And before we jump, the Coming Clean podcast is grateful to be powered by Ørsted, a wonderful company strengthening America's energy security with reliable and domestic clean energy. Through its integrated renewable energy solutions, Ørsted is creating American jobs, investing in American communities, and driving American innovation, all while preserving our country's natural habitats. A clean energy future truly connects us all, and Ørsted is helping lead the charge. To learn more, visit us.orsted.com.